All right. Well, first of all, we'll just give you some history first. We have been having discussions here in Virginia, Bob and Bobby and I, with our brewery, and we've been trying to talk about what are we going to do if we have an avian influenza outbreak within our broiler breeder industry. We all felt pretty comfortable here in Virginia with what we're going to do with our meat birds, both turkeys and chickens. Where we really had some concerns is our broiler breeders because of the housing structures and exactly what that might look like. We've been having these conversations for 2 or 3 years, but we really were not at a place where we had a good plan. We've been talking about it, but we just hadn't been able to pull it off. As many of you know, Edward and others up in Canada have done these broiler in-house composting on these broiler breeder operations, but in the United States we had not. And we've also been having some conversations with Josh Payne, who is working on parallel routes, trying to do a demonstration with some of his partners. And right prior to the AI situation that we had in the Southeast, we felt like we were very close to, Josh felt like he was very close to having a demonstration project ready to go, and he had a partner who was willing to do that. And then once we had AI, that project fell through. So just about that same time, we were in a conversation here with our poultry disease task force, and of course the industry at that point knew what was going on in the southeast, and they said, well, we're going to stop talking about this and we're going to do it. So that's sort of the evolution of that project, and very quickly we found a site in which to try that out. So again, as many of you are aware, earlier this year we had some HPAI and LPAI on broiler breeder farms. Was the main farm scenario where we had those. And there have been these questions about, can we do in-house composting, because we have all the equipment and all the issues associated with that. That really was a question, because our housing design is actually very different than the housing designs in Canada. So again, it's the design, it's the equipment, space limitation is the big issue. Because of that, burial became the most common option during 2017 with these broiler breeder operations. So in essence, they were dug a hole, and none of us here in this room, which is Bobby Clark and Bob Peer and I, were involved in those activities, but we understand they did bury the birds and bury the manure. And so in Virginia, we were trying to look at options so that we didn't have to use those options. So again, in Canada, they have been successful with that. Canada has a little bit different operations than we do. Here's a photograph from Canada. It shows that they have a concrete slab in the center, and they also have concrete floors in their pits, and they have pretty tall ceilings compared to what we do in Virginia. But again, it offers many, many challenges, and they were able to overcome it. And our thoughts were, let's figure out if we can overcome the same challenges and maybe some different challenges here in Virginia. So if we look at a typical operation here, you can see a center scratch area down the middle. You have the slats and the nest along the sides. And typically underneath those slats, we have the depth and a pit. And the depth of that pit can vary between a few inches to a foot or so. So that's typically what those operations will look like. This photograph here is a photograph of the farm that we were doing the demonstration on. This particular area had a 12-foot center scratch, and we had 14 feet of manure and slat area where we had a variable pit that was 3 inches towards the center and up to 2 feet along the side. So that's sort of the design that we're working under. The biggest issue, though, really is the height of the ceiling and the equipment. You can see here from this photograph that the ceiling height is very low. It makes operating a challenge. Also, the equipment that you can see here, and particularly the nest boxes that are over top of the slat areas, can pose some real operating challenges with inside a house. Even with those challenges, our industry said, this is something that I really think we could do. We were very fortunate in Virginia that, we've had a number of conversations, and we have 3 broiler breeder companies or companies with broiler breeder farms, and all 3 of them agreed that this was important for us to figure this out and agreed to participate in a demonstration. One company in particular, Pilgrim's Pride, agreed to take the lead on the project, and they identified the houses. They donated the birds that were used. So what we had there was 4,000 hens and 400 roosters in a house. This particular house was at the end of this particular cycle, so it was the absolute worst case. And by worst case, I mean the amount of manure that was in the buildings was the most that there ever will be. The hens were 8.5 pounds. The roosters were 10.5 pounds. And so basically, we took all of that material, including about 75 tons of manure and litter, and we tried to compost that within this center scratch area, because that was really the only place where we could build a windrow with where we had enough ceiling height. Because again, underneath the pits where we had the nest hanging down, it was just too much or too low to really do a lot of activity in that area. So we thought really the best way to have this conversation was just to show you some pictures real quickly, and then the discussion. Again, Bobby Clark, Bob Peer are here with me, and we can answer questions and initiate some talk about what it takes and what went well and what we might do differently the next time. So anyhow, just to start this project, we started with the birds, and those birds, we don't have pictures of it here, but those birds were depopulated within that scratch area. In this particular case, the company used a CO2 process to do the depopulation. That's not to say that that is always the way that it will happen in Virginia. We also have at least one of our other companies who intends to use foam. So it might not look too much differently if it were done with foam, but your moisture content would certainly be higher. But this is basically the process that we started with. So as you can see, the birds are depopulated in the middle in the scratch area. We have moved the slats away from one of the over from one of the pits. The nest and the feeders are raised as high as they can. And that was the starting point of our composting process. So the first thing that we did, Bob took the volume of material that we had in terms of birds and manure, and he calculated our carbon needs. So that was one of the first activities. Then from there, we began the process of clearing that scratch. What we decided to do was to take all of the birds and all of the litter that was within that scratch area and first move it into the manure pit on one side of the building. So that's what you see here, is moving all of the birds and all the litter into the manure pit. And we did that to facilitate a good mixing between the manure and the litter. And so by just to make sure that that's clear to everybody, by manure, that is manure from these layer operations that doesn't have any carbon material in it. And by litter, I mean the material that's under the birds, which was a shaving material that certainly had manure mixed with it, but at least it did have some carbon material in it. So we're mixing all of that material there with clearing the scratch area, because that's where we were going to begin our operations. So we had, again, the birds were depopulated in the center of that house in that scratch area. So we did have on both ends, we had some litter that didn't have birds to evenly distribute that along that manure pit so that we could have an even distribution of that material, take some advantage of the carbon that was in there. And one of the things that Bobby is pointing out to me here is you can see that the 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 skid loader that is in the front, you can see that he is pushing that material into the pit, and he does not have the ability to clear those nest boxes. So you can see that it's very limited the kind of operation that you can do in these buildings, particularly within the pits, because of the clearance issues. So the actual skid loader that you see in the front is a traditional unit with a cab on it, but the unit in the back that you see is actually one that has the top removed. It was the only one that could actually push the material further and actually get under those nest boxes. So I just want to, that's a good distinction, Bobby, to point out there. All right, so this is a picture of that next step where you have all of the material cleared out of that center and you're ready to begin building your windrow within that center. So here we see the process of beginning to mix the manure and the litter and the birds and adding additional carbon to that material. So basically we had one skid loader bringing the material out from underneath the nest within that pit area and bringing that out to an area where a skid loader could add carbon material to it and mix it well. And then there's a third unit that you can see, and the purpose of that unit is to begin actually building the windrows. So now this is our first step, is this particular windrow, unlike in many types of floor raised birds, you cannot build from the side or like you do with layers outside. You have to build it from one section at a time because you can only access it through the end. So we started by building a base that was about 10 feet or so wide, and it was only about 6 foot deep. And the reason for that is you had to build the base, you had to put the core, and you had to cap all from one end. And if you built a longer section than that, then you'd be running over your base, which was going to defeat, which was going to hamper its ability to actually get oxygen into the pile. So section by section was how that went. And you can see here as we are progressing down the house, again, it is capped as we go along. So here first there was a bucket of the mulch material that was added as the base. There is a little bit of hand labor there that is involved with leveling that out. But the other thing that happens is, particularly with like these roosters, these bigger birds, as you try to build it from the end, some of those birds will roll off that pile as you're building it. So they're doing a little bit of effort in terms of leveling the base, but most of the time what they're doing is they're trying to take those birds that have rolled off the pile into the toe and put them back into the center of the windrow. So one of the things that we found very important here was the ability to communicate with a person who is showing the operator where to dump the material, how much material to dump. And the best way to make that work was with hand signals. And I'll have Bob explain that process to you.
Yeah, as we were progressing down the house, it became apparent that the operator needed guidance, especially with the ceiling height, how far up he could go with the bucket, whether he needed to go get more birds and the mix of birds and material, when to cap it. And so there was another guy there, one of the servicemen for Pilgrim Pride. Between the two of us, kind of developed hand signals for telling the operator, as far as tipping the bucket, the ceiling height, getting a cap, and so we kind of developed a set of hand signals for that was very helpful. Otherwise, we'd have to stop and go over to the operator and tell him what needed to be done, and that just became too inefficient. And so after we got about halfway through the house, it really started to go very quickly, especially using this hand signal.
All right, thank you. So in the end, what we ended up with is a windrow down the center of the house that had all of our birds and all of our litter and all of our one side of the building from underneath the slats. So that's important to make clear that we still have another side of the building where underneath the slats we have manure, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But this picture you see in front of you, that is the windrow that was constructed within that building. So just to give you an idea for timeline here, the entire euthanasia process took about 2 hours and 20 minutes. And so basically that was moving the animals to one area where they were confined and use CO2 gas to make that happen. After that occurred, then we had to move the slats to one side. That took almost an hour to do that. And then it took about 40 minutes to do the process that we explained of taking all the material out of the center and that scratch area and moving it to the manure pits. And then it took us about another 4 hours and 20 minutes to actually construct the windrow. So just in general, we feel pretty confident that this process would take us half as much time to do it in another house, just because as we spent a lot of time, we'd stop, we'd talk, and see if we wanted to make any changes and figure out better ways to communicate. So this is a process that would go more quickly if it were to be repeated. So one of the things that's important to talk about here is temperatures. Now, so our temperature data so this particular farm is going back into production. So our access to the farm is pretty limited. So this is just some data for the first few days. And I don't have the actual data for the total 14-day cycle, but we'll tell you about it. So basically what we had a tremendous amount of manure, the most manure that you're ever going to have in one of these operations. And we had a lot of birds and we were trying to get it into a very small space. What that meant is that we were skimping on our carbon material. So as we progressed, those numbers increased a little bit, but ultimately we were reaching for the rest of that cycle pretty much the same temperatures as you see in day 4 and 5. We had averages within the pile, within the core, and we were taking temperatures at both 18 and 36, but we had temperatures that were in that on average about 125 degrees. So we were not meeting our primary standard within that first cycle. We were certainly meeting our secondary standard of 110 for 10 days. So we did meet that secondary standard, but not our primary standard. So what we did then is we had to go and after our 14-day time period and do our turn. And the way that we did this for this operation was we moved that material out of the house for its second composting cycle. And what we did is we took the material out, and as we brought the material out, we mixed it with the remaining manure that was underneath the other slats. So that required physically moving the slats over by hand. So that was a pretty time-consuming and tedious process. We did get a good mix of that manure and the compost within the house, and then we capped it. And ultimately, that did work, very well for us. And we'll look at some temperatures. We'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. As we had our hot wash with the companies after this process, we talked about, will we do anything different? And ultimately, everybody was very pleased with the way that worked. The one thing that we decided that we would do differently the next time would be that we would move all of that compost material outside and cap it, and then we would actually use the slat movers that are attachment to the skid loaders and mechanically move the slats over and then take the manure out, add carbon to it, and create a new windrow with that carbon, with that manure, so that it didn't take so long to mix and move those slats by hand. So it took about 5 hours to move all of that material out of the house and form new windrows, including incorporating the manure from underneath the slats on the other side. So we feel like that would go much faster if we did that separately. By separately, I mean first the compost and then the manure. It certainly would require a little more carbon material to do that, but we think in terms of time savings, that would be a better option. So just to give you an idea, we are within the second cycle right now. We have a little bit more data. We don't have it here in front of us, but we did reach our temperatures, our primary standard, very rapidly, and the temperatures have continued to increase and stay steady. So once we mixed it together and we incorporated everything well, our temperatures are doing great. So we're very excited about how we look in terms of temperature kill. The other thing is the material itself, the carcass decomposition looked really great. So the windrows that you see here are of the material as it came out of the houses. So this is a mixture of manure and the compost. And as you can see, there's very little carcass. There's very few carcasses that are actually identifiable at this stage. That's not to say that we didn't have a few that must have rolled to the toe of the pile. So there were a few carcasses, but generally speaking, what was observable is a little bit of very, very well cooked meat, and the same things really that you would expect to see at this 14-day stage in the process. And Bobby, you have something to add?
Yeah, we did have to have a little bit of hand labor out here. Some of them would roll to the bottom of the pile, and so we had one person out there with a pitchfork throwing, those few that weren't fully composted into the center of the pile, so they would go on and finish.
All right. So again, we were very pleased with how that material looked after 14 days, and after we moved it out, then we ended up capping the pile with some material. We didn't have to put a very thick cap on. We only put a cap of it was about 3 or 4 inches. So it was really wasn't a big cap, but we did cap the pile. We did not encounter issues with flies, odor. We actually have a very prominent and popular not livestock, but produce auction that is visible from the sites. So we were somewhat concerned about odor, but you can sort of see in the background that there was the neighboring farmer was spreading liquid manure at the same time. So it really didn't matter. But we didn't really observe any odor at all from this process other than a little bit of ammonia that you might expect, but the material smelled really great. Again, part of that might have been because we couldn't smell good because of the liquid manure that was going down at the same time. So we're very, very pleased with this process and the outcomes. I want to just point out that, again, this was a project that we did have a lead company with Pride, so we want to thank Pilgrim's Pride and also the other industry partners that were involved. So with that, and I apologize, I think maybe I did not say it. So again, Josh Payne's project that he was working on fell through, and because we were all working on this idea of trying to come up with what it would look like to do composting in-house for a broiler breeder operation, we involved Josh in that project, and we're very fortunate that he was able to come up and join us in Virginia. So this particular project was a collaboration between Bob and Bobby and Josh and I, and of course the industry. So thank you, Josh. I know he's not on the phone, for making the time to come up and join us. So that is the extent of the presentation. We want to answer any questions that you have. I'm going to go ahead and shift screens now so that we can have better control over the mutes and unmuting the line. So let me go ahead and do that. So we'll go ahead and take your questions at this point.
Oh, hi, Gary. This is Lori. Really
And I have just
interesting.
unmuted everybody. So if you have questions for Bobby or Bob or I, let's go ahead and have them.
Hello?
Do we have any questions?
Can you hear me?
All right, well then I'm going to stop recording.